Just to say a couple things and to welcome Director Dillaha and Mr. Floyd. I've had the opportunity to meet a very few number of great men in my life. After I came here 4 years ago, I think, soon after I arrived, Dr. Bates arrived in my office, and we had a great conversation. And I have to say, it was wonderful to have him as a mentor during the time that he was here in the college while I was here as well. He taught me a great deal about public health. He taught me a lot about Arkansas. And I think more importantly, he taught me what does it take to be successful in public health in not necessarily always a supportive environment. Like I said, Joe was a great man, I think. He was a great American. He was a great Arkansan. And I can truthfully say, I don't say that about very many people. It was my privilege to know him, so I'm gratified to see all of you here tonight, and just to assure you, we miss Joe a lot.
Thank you, Dean Williams. Now I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, and thank you all for being here. First, Larry Floyd, who's the co-author of the book, Stalking the Great Killer, and just a brief little bio of some bio information. Larry has taught U.S. history for the last 11 years at the Oklahoma City campus of Oklahoma State University, and has co-authored, or ghostwritten 5 books prior to this most recent book, Stalking the Great Killer. Stalking the Great Killer is the second book published by the University of Oklahoma Press following Oklahoma hiking trails in 2010. And his latest book, which should be out early in 2024, is Waiting for America, the story of American civilians in the Philippines imprisoned by Japan during World War II. Next, we have Dr. Jennifer Dillaha. Since joining the Arkansas Department of Health in 2001, she has served in a variety of roles. Most recently, she was appointed director of the Arkansas Department of Health and the state health officer for Arkansas, and that was in May of 2022. Before that, she was the ADH Chief Medical Officer, Medical Director for Immunizations, and Medical Director for Outbreak Response. She also served previously as a state epidemiologist from March 2020 to August 2021, and special advisor for strategic initiatives in the Office of the Director from June 2010 to April 2013, and Director of the Center for Health Advancement from August 2005 to June 2010. Boy, that's a mouthful. So thank you, Dr. Dillaha, for being here. And then finally, we have Dr. Sandra Chai. She earned her BS in zoology from the University of Oklahoma. There's not going to be any rivalry between OSU and OU, right? And she attended medical school at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine. She then attended UAMS for her internship and residency in internal medicine, followed by a fellowship in pulmonary and critical care medicine. And she joined the ADH infectious diseases branch in 2014, primarily focusing on tuberculosis, and she now serves as the assistant TB controller for the state of Arkansas. So thank you all for being here, welcome. And they're going to talk a little bit about their experiences with Dr. Bates, or association with Dr. Bates, and just about the treatment of TB. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Larry.
Watch pretty closely when you have this mic up, about 5 inches from your mouth. Is that?
Can y'all hear it?
You're okay. Better. Good. I'm going to talk a little bit about the backstory of the book. Everybody really likes to hear about how a book sort of gets started. Before I do that, I want to talk about what a joyful experience it was to actually get to work with Dr. Joe Bates on this book. I mean, it was just a pleasure and a thrill. Every time we met, we had numerous meetings and discussions. It was always just a pleasure to sit down for sometimes 2 and 3 hours to work with him on this project. And that said, I met a doctor that had been a young intern that Joe supervised at one time, and he said that he and the other interns were terrorized by Dr. Bates. They just, not that he terrorized them, but they were so concerned he was so exacting and required them to be, so proficient. And I thought about that because the Joe Bates I met was always so easygoing and calm and just fun to be around. But I think that really speaks to the excellence in medicine that he wanted to get from those students, those medical students, those interns. And so it really speaks well that he actually had those who knew him personally. He's pretty easygoing and just really fun to be around, but yet those interns were, they were on point, on guard. He expected a lot from them. They understood that. That struck me because when I talked to that doctor, it was so different than the Joe that I had worked with. Not that he was lackadaisical. He was always very knowledgeable when we talked, but he was so easy to work with. Just a real joy. So I wanted to get that said first. The origins of all books are always something people are interested in. This one had a good beginning. It's Jim Wallace over here on the couch is Joe Bates' first cousin. They were sort of pretty close. Jim grew up in Little Rock, but then he left the state and went to Oklahoma to make his fortune in oil and gas, and he did quite well at that too. He had moved back to Arkansas about 2016, and he always knew that Joe had been a prominent physician, had done, was well known in Arkansas and very highly respected. He didn't really know the whole story. And his grandson was visiting, and he wanted, his grandson was making some career choices. I guess he was a young teenager at the time. And so he thought it'd be a good idea to have dinner with Donna and Joe, and they could sit down and Joe could talk to Jim's grandson, Andrew, about maybe a career in medicine. Well, Joe doesn't like talking about himself, so when they had dinner, he was, kind of reluctant, wasn't saying too much. And Donna started talking about his TB work, which is what so much that people know about him in Arkansas, and how he had pioneered so much of the treatment and the control of TB. And Jim sat there astounded. He was like, "This is my cousin. I never heard this story." And so Jim began working on Joe to somehow put this into a book. And of course, Joe was reluctant. He didn't want to be a book blowing his horn. And so I worked with Pat, who's also here sitting next to Jim, on some books that she does. And so next time I was visiting here, Jim asked me to work on Joe and see if maybe I couldn't talk him into doing this story, putting it into a book format. So Joe was very reluctant, of course, and I convinced him by telling him it's not going to be a book about you, Joe. You may be one of the characters in the book, but it's going to be in context of this terrible plague, the great killer, tuberculosis, and what it had done throughout the entire world, not to mention Arkansas. Arkansas was particularly plagued with tuberculosis. So, and Joe said, okay, but it's not going to be all about me. And so the last conversation I had with him, just the week before he died, whenever we were talking about he wasn't going to be around to do any book signings, and he knew that. He said, if you do a book signing, I want you to mention a couple of names, not just my name. And that was Bill Steed and Paul Reagan. And I know Jennifer said that she knew Bill Steed, but Paul Reagan was sort of a name from the past. And so I'll talk about those two in just a minute. There was a couple other names that I wanted to talk about that played a role in this book. Earl Chambers, who was a woman in the first half of the 20th century who did so much to organize the Tuberculosis Association, and really was really a leading citizen of Arkansas that has been kind of lost in time. As I researched this, she really popped out. For about 3 decades, she was sort of the champion of trying to get this awful plague under control in Arkansas. Of course, without medication, it was more a matter of sanatoriums and isolating people. And then J.D. Riley, who was the director for a long time of the sanatorium in Boozman, Arkansas. And Joe told me he actually met Dr. Riley. Dr. Riley was in the final years of his life, but not to say his career. Joe was just getting started as a doctor, and they crossed paths briefly. And I remember, I'll never forget, Joe said he was a towering figure in the Arkansas medical community. I think I used that same phrase in the book, a towering figure. To me, it was just so dramatic how he said that. So there were other names that were involved. And so once Joe was aware that I was going to actually not make the book all about him, he was much more cooperative and eager to get this book done. So Paul Reagan was a young doctor, just a couple of years older than Joe. Paul Reagan had grown up in Arkansas. His dad was a physician for a long time in Dillaha. He had gone back east, had gone to, I think, Harvard Medical School. So he came back about the same time Joe was finishing up at the University of Arkansas. And so some of their internship was done together. They become fast friends. Well, as time progressed, Paul Reagan went to work for the health department. It was sort of the first, I think he was kind of the first coordinator of tuberculosis for the health department. And so that was a topic that Joe had been intrigued by since he was a teenager, when he had taken his uncle to the sanatorium for treatment back when he was still in high school. And so they start collaborating. And to me, one of the most interesting parts of the book is when these young physicians are trying, and this is in the 60s, by the drugs were out, people were still experimenting, they were still trying to figure out how to use these drugs most effectively. But Joe and Paul started seeing things that other doctors didn't, probably because they were a little younger and a little more open to some new ideas. And the idea of sending people to the sanatorium was pretty much standard, especially in Arkansas with that big sanatorium. Well, these two young physicians around 1965 or 66 are talking about this at happy hour one day after work, and they start brainstorming about somehow using general hospitals and treating these patients on a community basis so they could stay with their families, not lose their jobs, not go bankrupt, which is what so often happened to these TB patients that go into 2 or 3 years or longer in treatment at a sanatorium. They'd lose everything they had, and many of them lost their marriages. Well, they jotted down on some cocktail napkins their ideas about using general hospitals for community-based treatment. And they just ran with it. And they were able to start convincing people, not everyone, even the director of the state health department was a very hard sell, as Joe said. And if they could convince him, they thought they could convince just about anyone, and they did. To me, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the whole book. And this Arkansas became a national leader because of these two young physicians bucking the trend and sticking with their ideas and proving that it could work. And of course, that eventually led to the closing of the sanatorium in Boozman. And that is another very interesting aspect of the book, because that sanatorium had so much political support. There was local jobs, and it had been around forever, and a lot of the medical community didn't want to see it closed. So that was another fight. To me, those are some of the more interesting aspects of the whole book. I want to talk a little bit about some of the sources. And of course, a key source was Joe himself, because he lived through so many of those years, especially the critical years of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the drug therapies came out and the sanatorium became obsolete, and the fight that he had trying to get that closed. And Paul Reagan, his ally, left in the middle of that fight. Paul Reagan left in 1968 under a cloud. He was very outspoken. He didn't have too many good friends or allies in the medical community. He eventually left the state. He came back. Joe made sure he came back 10 or 15 years later to get some awards that Joe knew that he deserved. And so Paul Reagan was a name that Joe said definitely needs to be talked about. So he plays a prominent role in the book, even though he left before the fight was over, so Joe had to carry the fight after that. Talking about sources, of course, Joe, as I said, was a primary source. He saw firsthand so much of this and was able to fill in a lot of details that I couldn't get. But they say that newspapers are always the first draft of history, and I'm a big believer in that. And so, especially in the first part of the 20th century, when tuberculosis was sweeping across the state, and no one really knew that much about it. Even the medical community was sort of in the dark about this awful plague. The newspapers were my primary source of the community action and the organization and a lot of the efforts that eventually led to some of the successes of the 50s and 60s and eventually getting tuberculosis completely under control. Also, the library in Boonville, the Payne County Library, has an excellent collection. If anyone ever wants to do any research of the early years of tuberculosis in Arkansas, and especially of the sanatorium, the Payne County Library in Boonville they've got 40 years of that monthly newsletter / magazine that the sanatorium put out that really gives you an excellent picture of the state's efforts to get tuberculosis under control. And it had a lot of national articles, a lot of articles that talked about some of the newest research and trying to give some hope to those patients that were going through this terrible time in their lives. Many of them, about half of them, never made it out of that sanatorium. The lucky ones would get their disease to go in remission, but the newsletter was such a lifeline for them, I think. And so some of the articles were to give them some hope by talking about some of the cutting-edge research that was going on. Also, the Tim Nutt's UAMS Research Center, there's some key documents there that also served as a good source for this book. So that's about all I have to say. I'm certainly not I don't have a medical background. My background is historical research and historical writing. So I'm going to let these two medical experts here talk a little bit more about the technical side. And I think after we all finish talking, we'll throw it up to any questions or comments that anyone has.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about Dr. Bates. One of the things that stands out to me about Dr. Bates is his ability to mentor and support the career development of other people. So I'd like to talk about that from my own experience. When I was a senior medical student, I decided that I would like to do an elective at the CDC. I was interested in public health, but we didn't have any public health training available in Arkansas at that time. And I was interested in infectious diseases, so they assigned me to the Tuberculosis Elimination Division at the CDC for 8 weeks. Well, I thought, I guess I better figure out what's going on with TB in Arkansas before I go, so I don't look stupid. So I talked with the head of infectious diseases here, Bob Bradshaw, about it, and he suggested that I meet with Bill Stead. Dr. Stead would come over here and attend internal medicine grand rounds at noon on every Thursday. So I came and he introduced me, and Dr. Stead invited me to sit with him during grand rounds, and afterwards we went to lunch. And then we went to a research meeting at Dr. Joe Bates' research lab at the VA. Well, that was all very interesting to me, and Dr. Bates was very welcoming. My father was about 10 years older than Dr. Bates, but he had been chair of the Department of Dermatology here at UAMS. He started the Department of Dermatology way back when. So he knew who my father was. And so I think that I don't know, he just felt like to me he was honoring my father to invite me to be part of all that. So then I was trying to explain to Dr. Stead and Dr. Bates I was going to do this elective at the CDC, but I don't think they really grasped it. So when I went to the elective, did this elective, while we were there, this request for a phone conference from 2 doctors in Arkansas came to the CDC TB Elimination Division. It was these 2 doctors named Dr. Stead and Dr. Bates. So they put us all on a conference call, and so everybody in Arkansas went around and said who's on the call. And then at the CDC, everybody went around. I went last, and I said, well, this is Jennifer Dillaha. I'm a senior medical student at UAMS. And you could hear Dr. Bates on the other end going, Jennifer, this is Joe Bates. What are you doing there? Anyway, when I came back, I got involved in the research in Dr. Bates' lab eventually. But as I worked on what I would do with my career, I can distinctly remember a meeting with Dr. Bates in his office at the VA, where he talked about the potential for my career development. And he made an explicit commitment to help me and be my mentor for my career. And that was very touching to me because my dad died when I was 13 years old. I didn't have anyone like that around who could help me, and he was willing to take me on. I worked and did my training. I trained in infectious diseases and geriatric medicine. And during the training, Dr. Bates up and retired. And I thought, oh my word, I have lost my mentor. Went to the health department, and lo and behold, eventually he recruited me there. He knew that I had a heart for public health. And so I worked with him there for over 20 years. He was good at guiding me in terms of the public health issues. I won't say that we never had any conflicts, but one thing I learned from him was to stand my ground, and even when I disagreed, offer some respect. And as a result of the mentoring and the years at the health department, I feel that I've been able to make a contribution to public health in Arkansas. And I don't know that that would have been possible without having someone like him. I guess it's like a figurative hand on the shoulder, you know, being able to encourage, challenge, and I don't know how he did it. He has a way of orchestrating things to recruit the right people for the right place in the right spot and see their potential and encourage them to grow. So I'm just extremely grateful for his hand in my life. So I'll stop.
Well, I was one of the residents who was terrified. But I needed to be because he was actually very gracious back when I was in training as well. So I'm really grateful that you coaxed this book out of Dr. Bates because I heard many of these stories from him over the years that you tell in your book, but he was too humble ever to say, oh, and by the way, that's the first time anybody ever did that. Or by the way, that's the first time anyone ever noticed that or knew that. This was new information. This was groundbreaking news in the world of TV. The only time he'd ever say that something was like an incredible first is if he could give the credit to somebody else. So I'm grateful to have heard the stories from him, and I'm grateful to be able to put them in context because of your work. And, as one who now takes care of TB patients in Arkansas, I just have such a greater perspective in terms of kind of where I fit in that story. And as I was telling Dr. Zohuri earlier, there's no way anyone could fill Dr. Bates's or Dr. Stead's shoes, but we get to stand on their shoulders, and that's amazing. So I want to share something that Dr. Bates, this is actually from Dr. Bates from several years ago, and I'm doing this because I see a camera and I have no idea what y'all are going to do with that, but I'm gonna get on the TV soapbox here for just a moment. So your book tells the story of how Arkansas went from, a short century ago, tuberculosis was like the #1 cause of death. You could almost think of it like the COVID-19 pandemic, except that instead of having it for a week or 10 days, you'd have it for years. And only 25% of patients arrested. So you know what happened to the rest of them, right? So if your disease didn't stabilize, that was very bad news in the long run. And then, at one time in the 50s and 60s, we had the highest TB rate in the nation here in Arkansas. So I want to share something from a letter from Dr. Bates. This, in a sense, it's a little bit of an epilogue to the book, but it's not where the story's going to end. So he wrote this in September 2018, and he wrote it to the physicians of Arkansas. He did this along with Dr. Nate Smith, who was our director before Dr. Dillaha. And I'm going to share just a little bit out of the letter. It says, Dear Arkansas physician, we want to bring to your attention some concerns about tuberculosis control in Arkansas. As many of you know, Arkansas had the highest TB case rate in the nation in the 1950s and 60s. To put that in perspective, we were essentially like a TB endemic state. So he goes on, to solve this major health problem, the Department of Health worked together with practicing physicians, hospitals, and educational institutions to develop an innovative network of chest clinics and hospitals to diagnose and treat TB. And you go into great detail in your book about that. And another aside, this is what allowed us to pivot away from using the sanatorium. He goes on, this effort was highly successful, and by the 1990s, the TB case rate in Arkansas was the same as the U.S. rate. Now, over the last decade, TB has become an uncommon but not a rare disease in Arkansas. However, our success has brought with it some unwanted problems, and that is why we ask for your thoughts on health. In recent years, we have registered about 100 new TB cases per year. I'm happy to tell you it's lower than that now. But as we evaluate these new cases, a troubling pattern has emerged. Now, more and more of these cases have advanced disease with positive sputum smears for AFB when first diagnosed. Many of these patients have remained highly infectious for longer intervals than in the past, resulting in more transmission of infection to their contacts. If this trend is not interrupted, the case rate in Arkansas will once again begin to increase. So just from the perspective of where we are now in TB, I want to tell you, just in case this goes out to the ears of anyone who can make an impact, I'm a clinician, you never know when you might have the opportunity to save a life. So I want to tell you that over the last several years here in Arkansas, we have struggled with a couple of very large outbreaks of tuberculosis. One in southwest Arkansas, another one in eastern and northeastern Arkansas. Each of these clusters had about 30 cases, and we're still counting. That's a huge number of active tuberculosis cases. And whereas we often think of tuberculosis as something coming to us from foreign shores, which is true for most of the U.S., that is not true here in Arkansas. Still, over half of the cases, the active cases that we see every year, are homegrown Americans. And that's true of these two large clusters, these two large outbreaks. They're all U.S. born. In fact, they are small town Arkansans. And they're young people. They're in their 20s and 30s. And in the eastern cluster, half of that is children. Many of them have presented with very advanced disease, so terrible cavitary lung disease, large portions of the lung forever destroyed. Some of them have been disseminated cases, and some very ill, sick nigh unto death. One was a 20-year-old young man who was on a ventilator for weeks, hanging by a thread. So you might wonder, what on earth happened here? Well, in both cases, these were very close friend and family groups that tuberculosis spread among. But TB doesn't happen overnight, so how did that happen? And the bottom line here is that there is a lack of awareness of tuberculosis in the general community and also in the medical community. So these people were sick for months and years, but it never occurred to any of them on their own to say, wow, could this be TB? And to go and ask their doctors. Actually, I'm going to take that back. In the second cluster, the word kind of got out better than in the first cluster, and they were asking and seeking care, so God bless them for that. But the healthcare community also failed to recognize that this was what was going on, and so these people languished for a very long period of time. They were diagnosed very late, and there was a lot of spread. And the cases we know of are really the low-hanging fruit. So these are people in these close friend and family groups, but they had work contacts, neighbors, other people. There are certainly more cases of tuberculosis out in the community than we yet know of related to these clusters. So the bottom line here, and the point of Dr. Bates's 2018 letter, is that we still need to think about tuberculosis. So I want to say to the community and to our healthcare professionals, the symptoms of TB are a persistent cough, recurrent quote-unquote pneumonia or bronchitis. You might take antibiotics for a while, feel better for maybe a few weeks, and then get sick again. Persistent fever, unexplained weight loss, drenching night sweats, chest pain, shortness of breath, and coughing up blood, although I will say coughing up blood, however dramatic, is actually in a minority of cases. And so, if you're a person in the community and any of that happens to you or someone you know or love, think, could it be tuberculosis? And, talk to your doctor about it. Testing is easy. It's a chest x-ray and a blood test. It's not high tech, it's not expensive, it's not difficult to access. And, if you're a physician or a provider who's taking care of anyone who tells you that story, then do a chest x-ray. And I just want to say, you might save a life. So I will now step off the soapbox. But that's in Dr. Bates's honor and memory.
I guess we're going to, anyone has questions or comments?
I do, I always have a question. So I would like to ask you about the research you did on the two sanitariums, or at least the two sanitarium systems that were in Arkansas. And the one that, being raised in the north, I would have never thought about was the sanitarium that was part of segregation that was there for the African American population. Being not a historian, how did that information come about, and how did you dig up that information on what they did, how they did it, and essentially what were the consequences of that sanitarium?
Well, first, how I found out about it was, I think that was in the 1920s and 30s when they realized there was no sanatorium for black people in Arkansas. The sanatorium opened around 1910 in Boonville. And I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Earl Chambers, she was that woman who was so active. It was really kind of the leader of the movement in Arkansas to control Arkansas. She was executive director of the Tuberculosis Association, so she did all the work. And she was the one who recognized that, and she's the one who pushed very hard. She even got herself elected to the state legislature just for that one reason. And as soon as she got the money, she didn't want to be a politician anymore, so she only served that one term. But she was able to ally with enough people in the legislature, and there was a governor, his name escapes me right now, she was able to get his attention and get him committed to it. And that's how it came about. And how I knew about it was there was a lot of articles in the paper, but I think it was in the UAMS Research Library where the early files on the Tuberculosis Association were. And so that's how I read about it. But then I followed a lot of it in the Arkansas. At that time, it was the Gazette and the Democrat. They've gone together now. But the papers covered that. And the papers, I would say, especially the Arkansas Gazette, really championed the idea that Arkansas needs to have a sanatorium for black people. I think it was shameful that the state didn't have that. So the papers gave a lot of articles about it, but I think the Tuberculosis Association records, and each year they did an annual report. That's how I learned a lot about that. I can't remember the governor's name. I wish I could. They named the sanatorium after him.
McCray.
Yeah, he's the one who stepped up and made sure that the money was there. Ask some real technical questions here. We have two physicians.
So I have not read the book yet, though I do have a signed copy of it. But I'm wondering if y'all could share maybe, a story from the book. Tell us a story.
Well, I mentioned what I liked the most. To me, my favorite part was these two young physicians who were going against the establishment, and the happy hour wrote down a revolutionary idea of treating tuberculosis in the community that eventually evolved into a program that led the nation. For those of you who are MASH fans, to me it was Hawkeye Pierce and Trapper John who were going against the grain, and they knew they were right, and they knew it was going to be hard, but they did it anyhow. And that's my favorite part of all of it.
So, one thing that Dr. Bates and I had in common is we liked Porsches. So whenever I could ride with him to some place, I would go because I could ride in his Porsche. He used to go up to, I forgot what, Batesville, I think, to do chest clinic. And sometimes I'd have to fill in with him. And I always said, I'll need to do it if you let me drive your Porsche up there. Anyway, so one time we were driving to, I think Mount Magazine for a meeting, and I asked him about what got him interested in tuberculosis, and he talked about driving his uncle to the sanatorium. And that's the opening part of the book. And he, that had a really big impact on him and motivated him to learn about TB and do something about it. So.
one of the stories Dr. Bates tells in the book and had also told me, it's almost hard to fathom now how much we've learned and the stuff that we take for granted, the knowledge that we take for granted now that, that we didn't have before. So he tells a story about working in the emergency room, and somebody brought in a 14-year-old black boy, and he recognized that this kid had tuberculosis. And he was aware of a study in rats that showed that tuberculosis was airborne. Somebody parked a bunch of rat cages above the rooms of tuberculosis patients in a VA hospital. And the only way that the TB could spread from the patients to the rats was through the ventilation system. That was the only connection between the spaces. And when he encountered this kid in the ER, he was curious, where did he live, what were the circumstances, and he learned that this kid lived at a place called the Industrial School for Negro Boys. I know it was back in the day, right? And so he went out there, and he was aware of the rat experiment, and he was really interested in that. Because you see, until then, nobody knew how tuberculosis was actually transmitted. And people would go crazy, trying to sterilize surfaces. And he said he remembered times at the working with people, and if somebody had TB, they'd go and wash all their stuff, including the money in their wallet and that kind of thing, because they were really scared that it was by contact. And, but he saw in the rat experiment, this is airborne. But he thought, there's no way, you could never do that experiment in humans because it would be unethical. But when he went to the Industrial School for Boys, he realized that they had sort of done the experiment for him, because they tested the kids for tuberculosis with a skin test on intake. And then as he looked very carefully at where the boys were all situated in like the same bunk, and they slept in this huge space, it may have been about the size of this room. And the kids didn't change position, so it's not like they were moving around to different bunks. They were parked wherever they were parked. And then there were other activities that they had, like there's a boys' choir and things like that. And he came to realize that if this kid was the index case, and we knew who was positive when they already came into the school, we could do another round of testing and see who had converted. And they did find some additional active cases, but those were not necessarily the kids that were parked right around. They weren't sleeping within 6 feet of them, for example, but they might be at the far end of the room. So this was really the first time that we knew in humans that tuberculosis was an airborne disease. And so he tells me the story, but he didn't say, and that's when we really finally knew. Well, that's huge. And as we saw in the pandemic, of course, understanding airborne transmission is huge. And it was part of his work with tuberculosis that helped us understand the ramifications for COVID-19 as well. So anyway, again, he never gave the caveat that, yeah, now we know, or now we knew, but it's just amazing the stuff we took for granted that this man figured out.
One of the things that interested me in reading the book was the account of the major revolution that occurred when the sanatoriums were actually closed. Five-story building closed, and you all may have a better feel for this, and from having worked with him and have caught comments off the record about what he put in. The interesting thing to me is that it must have taken, those of us who knew Joe Bates knew that he had a strong personality, such that, I'm amazed that we're having water in plastic bottles, because he would say that it's not as good for you as gasoline, and it's, but those of you who know the story of how this came about. I wonder how much of it was through force of Joe's personality to get this revolution done, and how much of it just data-driven, these are the facts, this is what needs to be done. I know that there were strong vested interests that's included in the story in the book. Strong vested interests of people who wanted to keep the sanatoriums going because they had a vested interest in the sanatoriums, and to charge up against those vested interests and to present the facts. You know, for one thing, it took a lot of fortitude to push that through, and I wonder to what and Joe was rather modest about relating that, just like you. I've heard him tell those stories, and you know, you don't get very much of this person. This is what I told Harley and all that kind of stuff, you know. And there must have been a lot of that. What insight do you have from your experience with all this about how Joe managed to get this revolution in healthcare carried out? You know, how much of it was just sitting back and let the data speak for themselves, and how much was it carrying the flag and tooting the horn?
Well, I'm going to start out, but maybe you can add to it. Even though Dr. Bates had a really strong personality, he was the master of soft sell. And he would take his time bringing someone along to his point of view and provide them with information that they needed to bring them along. And, you know, one of the stories that I can tell you is the Clean Indoor Air Act. You know, we had a Board of Health that voted to make some changes, and the governor wouldn't sign it. And he was able to communicate with people around the governor enough information that eventually the governor decided to support it. But it wasn't confrontational, it was a supportive way of doing things. And I think that may differ from what I picked up in the book about Paul Reagan. I think Paul Reagan was more of a, I don't know, what's the opposite of soft sell, you know?
Confrontation.
Confrontational,
Very much.
you know. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Paul Reagan was very, very confrontational. That's why I think Joe was his only friend in the state. So whenever push came to shove, he was actually forced out of the health department on for bad conduct. I won't go into what it was, but it really didn't have anything to do with whether or not he was doing a good job. He was doing a great job, and Joe said they should have overlooked his conduct. It was just a way of getting rid of him because a lot of people didn't like him. As far as closing the sanatorium, this is something that Joe emphasized and really clarified in my mind. I had thought, well, Joe and Paul Reagan, you know, helped close the sanatorium because all these drugs were now available, and so that is what led to the closing of the sanatorium. Well, in a sense, that's true, but Joe emphasized that that was the national trend. The sanatoriums were closing all over the nation, but Joe said that there was a problem with that. They weren't setting up community-based treatment before they closed the sanatoriums in a lot of the states. And so what he and Paul Reagan did that was so revolutionary and so effective was they set up a community-based treatment system with general hospitals for the initial hospitalization. But they knew that with the drug therapy that someone would only be communicable, is that the right word, lady? Or communicable for about 2 weeks after they started the drug therapy. And so why send them off to the sanatorium? Put them in a general hospital, and then you can treat them. They can send them home, they go back to work, and they can follow up for the year or so that it took of drug therapy to finish it. So that was really what did it. It was the community-based treatment. And Joe said that he wasn't advocating for closing the sanatorium. until that community-based treatment was well established. But once they had the community-based treatment in place, there was no longer a reason for the sanatorium. So it was inevitable. And the Arkansas Gazette, I would say, was the leading proponent that was on their side, that was writing editorials 5 or 6 times a year saying, when are we going to close the sanatorium? We don't need it. Does that answer your question?
I'm going to add just one thing to that, if I may. So you were asking about personality versus science. I mean, he certainly had the personality, but also Dr. Zohuri shared something lovely with us recently. It's about an hour-long interview that he did with Dr. Bates at the at the county health officer meeting a few years ago. And one of Dr. Bates' concluding remarks, like, what would you like young clinicians to know? What's your message to people just emerging now? And one of the things he said was, if you have the science to back up your claim, and let me just say, he did have the science. He ran studies that proved that if someone was on medication for 14 days, they were no longer, even though they still had germs you could see in their sputum and cultures that would eventually be positive, he knew that 14 days of treatment rendered those germs inactive enough that they were no longer going to endanger the people around him. This is 1970s science. There are still people out there that don't know that in the TV world. I mean, once again, Arkansas is kind of ahead of the pack, if you can imagine. But what he said was, if the science backs you up, then persevere, because the science will win. And he believed that, and clearly he was right in this regard.
Thank you all. We are getting close to the end of the scheduled time for this event, but I want to thank you all, Dr. Chai, Dr. Dillaha, and Mr. Floyd for that. I would like to just make a remark. Dr. Bates's work at the sanatorium it's not sanitarium, I made that mistake one time with him. But the records from the sanatorium had been in Boonville, sitting in a storage room since the sanatorium closed in 1973. And a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago maybe, Dr. Bates visited with me about preserving those records, the patient records and the running of the facility and all. And he was really, he was very gently forceful about preserving those records, and he was instrumental in it. And so the Historical Research Center, the Department of Health, and the Arkansas State Archives grouped together, and those records have now been transferred. They were transferred last year, I believe, from Boonville down to the state archives, and they're eventually going to be, they're being indexed as we speak. And then at some point, whenever appropriate, the names and the indexes will be released to the public, and so people will be able to do research, statistical research and historical research in those records. So Dr. Bates was instrumental in that. Thank you all again for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. We still have some food left. Please partake in that. And Larry is here. If you have your book and you would like it signed, I'm sure he would be happy to sign it. And thank you all, Mrs. Bates, for being here. Thank you for Dr. Bates' family for being here. And thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.